Hi, everyone. Welcome today. I'm super excited to have you all here for the new FDA, FSMA, and AI webinar, where we have some great panelists joining us today. Um, Next slide. We're going to get started right away just because we have a packed amount of questions and a lot of questions also from the audience submitted. So we'll want to get through everything. I'm Nye Cannell, your host today from SafetyChain. Just quick thing on what FSMA Friday is, right? It's a monthly FSMA related news, regulation changes and updates, industry trends, and Q&A with the Acheson Group and SafetyChain. Next slide. Some things, right? Only the panelists' microphones are on. Ask questions, Q&A at the end, put them in the chat. My team is monitoring. The recording link will be shared, and audio issues, please use the call-in number if you need to. Okay, well, let's introduce our panelists. I'm so excited to welcome Dr. Miller back. He's the EVP of Regulatory and Science Affairs at the Acheson Group. He has 25 years of food and safety, public health, and he's been a great, I would say, presenter for us in the past. And then also welcoming Dean Brown, CEO of SafetyChain. He has executive background in fintech, ERP implementations, and edtech, and really great experience with AI and developing AI. We also have Chris Bransey here, who's the founder of Frame and Flight. He has over 20 years of experience across Nestle, Starbucks, Google, and doing a lot of really cool things here in the food and beverage space. Everyone, will you say hello to our audience?
Thank you. Glad to be here.
All right.
Good.
Okay. We're going to go through our quick agenda, starting with regulatory updates, and I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Miller.
Yeah, thanks, Nye. Good to be with you all. Looking forward to the conversation. So just a couple of regulatory updates. One I wanted to highlight was the FDA's public meeting on lot level traceability. So that's a public meeting that's set to happen on June 15th. This is kind of an extension of the requirements that happened when Congress passed the ongoing funding bill back in November. So Congress charged the agency with looking and working with industry to have quarterly engagement meetings around lot level traceability for compliance around FSMA 204. So specifically looking at like case level tracing and tracking, within certain segments of the supply chain. So for those that may not be aware, there is going to be a public meeting. You can register by June 14th. And if somebody wants to make public comment, that registration is on June 5th. And so if you just Google FDA at FSMA 204 meeting, that should pop up for you fairly easily. I did want to highlight too, FDA this week had issued its first warning letter for the use of generative AI. I felt like that was timely given what we're going to be talking about here today. It was for a cosmetic company that had used generative AI to create some of their drug specifications, procedures, and master production records. And when the agency went in, they found that there essentially wasn't a human in the loop in that process. And so they called out the need for making sure that records generated by these systems have human review as part of that process. So I think this got a lot of buzz recently, at least in the kind of FDA regulated industry space around how's the agency thinking about that in terms of compliance, and what do we need to be thinking about relative to system development and what compliance looks like when we start to use some of these tools. So that may come up in the course of our discussion. We'll see, but I wanted to call it out. So.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Okay, getting into our topic, we're going to have a poll for the audience to start off with. How would you describe your organization's current AI readiness for compliance? Okay, please answer live. We'll give it a minute so that everyone can have a chance to ask.
Yes.
I don't know if something's funny, but I can't read all the answers coming through. team?
Looks good for me now. We're seeing fairly typical distribution of a lot of people. Half of the answers in pilot, and the others kind of spread out amongst building, experimenting.
Okay. Well, let's dive into our first question then. And then we'll let Dr. Miller answer since he's first on my set. Dr. Miller, you've spent 25 years in food and safety and worked directly with the FDA on traceability requirements. How does FSMA actually hold up when AI enters the compliance picture? And where does it start to show its age?
Good question, Nat. I think when we look at the way that the Food Safety Modernization Act was written, it was really written in a process-based manner. So, it doesn't get into too much around specifics in terms of, technologies or, specific technology requirements. It's again about kind of validation, verification, and then record keeping, right? And so I think that's a little bit of what we saw flagged in this warning letter, even though that product wasn't necessarily regulated by FSMA. It was more about what's the review process? Has that process been validated? And then who's doing that document review and that check? So, I think FSMA as a regulation holds up well because it's really a concept process-based regulation, but that's going to be important as we think about how these systems are designed and deployed, right? So, as we think about the use of agentic AI, maybe that's, you're creating agents to take the place of work that an individual might have done or to run a workflow that an individual might have done. It's going to be important to say, well, how do we know that that worked? What's the ongoing verification of that workflow? And, I think when we build processes into some of these systems, they're going to be smart. They're going to be able to kind of look and maybe make suggestions about ways to improve that process. But we also need to be cognizant of, are we building a compliant process into these agents to begin with? Because that will be important. It's something, I think the agency's probably learning about, as industry starts to experiment with some of these technologies at the same time. And, they're doing some experimentation with a lot of these technologies too. But it's going to be a little bit of a learn as we go. But I think that actually FSMA provides a pretty strong framework to sort of test the compliance of these systems over time.
Okay, great. Let's put up the next question. For all the panelists, what's the most persistent misconception you encounter when manufacturers start talking about using AI for compliance? Let's start with Dean.
Yeah, I'll segue from Dr. Miller's comments. We kind of see a bimodal distribution. Hey, oh my God, AI is going to replace people. This is amazing. In some horizontal applications, there is some replacement for sure. But we work in regulated industries where often the consequences are truly life and death. So for me, in the next couple of years, we're trying to make sure we're coaching people to understand that this is an augmentation phase, where, to Dr. Miller's point a minute ago, the AI can coach, it can counsel, it can recommend, it can harvest massive amounts of data and deliver insights that are actionable. And in most cases, they're incredible and they're right. But back to the warning letter, there needs to be human on the loop. And so right now, as we enter most companies, we see either the AI is going to be amazing, it's going to reduce costs, it's going to replace people, or the counter, which is, no, we can't use AI in this regulated world. Neither one of those are right. And so forming those opinions into a more holistic approach, I think, is something that, folks like Chris, as he's walking in, is spending a ton of time doing.
Great segue. Chris, can you give us your take on that question?
Yeah, thank you, Dean. And I wholeheartedly agree. This idea that AI is going to replace people is just frankly a huge misnomer. So I know there's these social narratives that are just spinning up all this unrealistic expectations about AI, but with an overemphasis on AI replacing people and agents being fully autonomous and taking over work and life and all of that stuff. But at a fundamental level, LLMs are really effective at a few basic things. So good places to start for your company are really looking to help you interpret standards and how to apply them in practice, supporting the design and governance of ownership models. So actually taking this process ownership framework and being able to put it into place and getting guidance there, and providing real-time guidance during key trigger and decision events. So like there's really good use cases for AI, but this social narrative out there that it's going to replace humans, I think, is just not the case.
And what's your take, Dr. Miller?
Yeah, I think Dean summarized it well. I think the answer is somewhere in between. When we look at, just the way that probably most food safety quality divisions or departments within a company are staffed and resources, we would always want more. And so I think, in at least the short to medium term, the use of some of these tools to really drive efficiencies in those processes actually frees people up to do some of the work that they should be doing that they haven't been able to do in the past because they're so focused on record keeping, and so I think that's a win. I do think, if the trajectory of development in some of these systems continues, like you can automate a lot of things. And so, there may be some future employment pressures in that space. And I think, it's something that we're going to all have to be collectively attentive to. But it's important. I think one of the things that's interesting is, so the Wharton School of Business at Penn State put out a paper back in February that talked about cognitive surrender and the use of AI systems. So that when we looked at, I think they looked at about 1,700 people and found that about 80% of the time people were willing to accept a wrong answer from an AI system just because of the way that the information was presented. It was presented in a credible way. And it's really hard to discern or differentiate between if an answer is right or if an answer is wrong. So keeping the human in the loop to know and have a good, strong understanding of what your underlying food safety processes are, I think is always going to be important, no matter how we choose to use these systems. And people make mistakes, and these systems, if they're well designed, will make fewer mistakes. But we also want to be careful not to turn over sort of all of the running of these processes and the deeper understanding of what a validated process is, and how do we look at and verify the outputs of those systems on a regular basis to ensure that they're actually functioning the way that we want them to, especially in the early days. I think that's probably where there's some reluctance and uptake, or just sort of slow approach. When we look at that poll, it's like, how do I know that these systems work, and can I really rely on that from a compliance standpoint? It also gets into data quality and sort of how easily and accessible is some of the data. It's definitely a challenge. I know it's one that SafetyChain's been focused on for a while in terms of how do we digitize food safety related data, but there's still a lot of records that exist, only on paper within the food industry. And so automating those processes becomes its own challenge.
100%. Let's actually stay on Dr. Miller. So next question. You've been on both sides of the regulatory table. Where are you seeing AI usage show up in audits, or different things?
Yeah, I think probably the most predominant or kind of well-known example, at least here in the US, is kind of FDA's use of machine learning models. But those are also in kind of interpretable models. They develop systems to look at imports, especially of things like seafood, to flag shipments that might be higher risk. When you've got 1,000 containers coming in a day, you want to target your resources. And so that's been a well-publicized model in terms of maybe not what we would think about in terms of agentic AI, but AI in a broader sense. And in there, in a regulatory agency capacity, at least historically, they've really kind of leaned into interpretability, right? How do I know, or how do I explain the decisions the system is making so that I can support that from a regulatory standpoint? So that's important, and I think it'll be important again, as I've touched on already, as industry starts to use and adopt these tools as well. I think we've seen limited use cases, and we're starting to see more, right? As this is kind of the snowball starting to roll down the hill and pick up speed and pick up mass and volume at the same time, and in people using either just simple LLMs to generate documents, SOPs, their food safety plans, things like that, or to actually perform some sort of audit function in terms of record review. And so there's a lot of companies out there that are trying to crack that nut and figure out what that looks like. And again, I think it gets back to a discussion around validation, verification, and kind of process monitoring, at its core.
Well said. Okay, we have another poll question coming up around data governance. So what's the biggest barrier to using AI in your compliance program right now? Okay, results are coming in. Okay, we're lining up. Interesting. Split across 3 of them coming through. Okay, all right. It looks like what took the lead is our data is disconnected across systems for the most part. There's about 36% is where people are lining up, and then it's also split between we don't have consistent processes across facilities and we don't trust AI outputs enough to act on them. Okay. All right, let's keep going. Okay, Dean and Chris, SafetyChain operates inside these manufacturing environments daily. When a customer wants to apply AI on top of their existing systems, what do you typically find when you look at what's actually there?
So we didn't game the poll. The poll results are indicative of what we typically see. We ran a survey that we do every year, and the number one factor that came out in the survey is the fragmentation of data. LIMS system over there, ERP system over there, quality data over there, production data over there, tribal knowledge floating around in Dr. Miller's head, all very, very difficult to synthesize. And one of the huge values of the tools that we have now, whether they are kind of math models around machine learning or they're some of the more recent LLMs, is the ability to synthesize data. But if you can't get the data or the data is crap, so what we see is this snowball effect that Dr. Miller's talking about. Let's go think about this AI thing. Absolutely. I mean, I'm drinking the Kool-Aid. But when we walk in, typically we see massive fragmentation of the data. And the second issue in the poll was processes. Processes, naming, consistency. We have a customer that wanted to look at root cause from a CAPA perspective across hundreds of facilities. Super smart thing to do. A great application for some of the emerging technologies. But the thing that took the most time in even trying to dig into the questions was plant number 112 has this type of naming convention and this data format, and plant number 218 has this. And the level of effort that went into just using ML techniques to categorize and then synthesize in a line was much more than the actual dig into the root cause analysis. So you were looking like 70-30, 70% of effort just to clean up the inconsistencies and fragmentation, and then 30% to actually get into some really interesting causal data. So we honestly see a mess.
Okay. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised by the poll at all. In fact, we see this all the time. We see underutilized platforms where you've actually made investments into large platforms, but they're just underutilized and they're not maturing over time. So you're not getting the value of structured data. Fractured data models, as Dean eloquently pointed out, you have, for global enterprises or even enterprises with just a handful of locations, you might have different data definitions from one location to the next, and one thing means one thing in one location, and another field means another thing in another location, and that's super common. Also, what is also kind of interesting is we, for some of these more mature enterprises, architectures and infrastructure that just frankly don't scale. That's pretty common, to be honest. But across all these maturity levels, AI is being applied without first defining how decisions should be supported across business through AI. And so when you think about not only your tool sets that you have and your technologies that you have, but and you want to put AI on top of these existing systems, you have to think about, well, what are the decisions that we want to be making as part of this improvement? And I've said many times that the most basic and highest impact use case for AI is frankly decision support. I think we use this all the time. I mean, if you have any level of membership of ChatGPT or Claude, I'm sure you ask it all sorts of different questions about life and about work and about finances and all this other stuff. And there's extreme value there. But one of the core challenges of food and beverage that we see is that quality and compliance decision making is largely implicit. So it lives in us, it lives in people, and it's not fully in structured systems. And so AI doesn't typically fix that problem. And so my advice is to actually start get platforms, start looking at your data, and structure your data around knowledge and decisions.
Great answer. Let's stay on you. So you've directed over 200 million in technology investments across hundreds of facilities and organizations like Starbucks and Nestle. What distinguishes the companies that make AI work from those that invest significantly and then those that have little return?
Yeah, it's a really good question because I read a statistic at one point in time that said that these AI projects that are spun up have about a 90% failure rate, and I'm just completely pulling that out of my pocket, so don't 100% quote me on that. But what I hear out in industry is that there's a lot of struggle there, and so. But the common approaches for applying AI and leveraging AI across your organization, it's like automating tasks, increasing individual productivity. This could be writing CAPAs faster, or it could be summarizing data that you might have stuck in a Excel spreadsheet somewhere, or generating insights based on a body of text that you have. So these are just fast and quick examples, but I wouldn't by any means call that transformational. And I think a lot of us, when we look at AI, we want to be able to move towards this transformational, set of work, right? And transformational projects. But enabling, such as I would say a lot of these, writing CAPAs faster and summarizing data are really just incremental improvements, right? So I wouldn't say that there's step change. But ultimately, the real goal of AI here is not just to do the same work faster. It should be, you should be enabling new forms of decision making and value creation that frankly previously didn't exist. And so the companies that we work with that kind of get it fall within, they think differently and they think within those buckets. They don't always have completely structured data, and they're not perfect. In fact, I've never seen a perfect company before. But they move from this, how do we automate tasks to, what capability have we never had before that we can now create? So that it's really kind of a change in thinking.
Okay. Let's take this next question to Dean. So implementing AI in a compliance environment requires a level of trust that doesn't come automatically. How do you build that trust internally across QA operations and leadership before it gets stress tested by a real situation?
Yeah, I mean, we saw it in our poll that you just put up, right? The number 3 or number 4 one was, we don't trust the AI. So it's a massive issue in the industry. Before I answer that, though, I just wanted to echo Chris's point. Jeffrey Moore, who's been around forever in the software world, and now he's looking at AI, exactly Chris's point. The opportunities here are in trapped value, places where we were never able to unlock the value in the past, as opposed to just the efficiencies that Chris pointed out. So I love Chris's point there a minute ago. On the trust side, I mean, as you're talking to your vendors, right, You need to be asking them where the training data comes from, and can I see this with my data? Because in a food safety culture, people need to see their data. They need to understand the traceability that Dr. Miller was talking about a minute ago. The decisions that are AI are going through cannot be black box, or people simply will not trust them. I mean, I am all in on the technology, but the black box element is an area that if I can't look at a traceability map of how a decision was arrived at, what data points were ascribed and what value, I'm all in and I don't trust it. So imagine going to a QA manager. So that's one. They have to be able to see their data. They have to see in, I would say, micro pilot type situations of why decisions would have been made. Run these pilots in parallel with your normal processes and have your continuous improvement teams look at the decisions that were arrived at, but more importantly, the trace back on why the decisions were generated. The big bang approaches here are very, very difficult, because what will happen is, as the machines are getting trained, et cetera, you're going to throw out a lot of false flags, a lot of noise, and people will just do like they did in the poll, right? They'll discount it, they won't trust it, they'll work around it, and all of a sudden you have this shadow system running next to the AI system, where managers are just pencil whipping the ways they used to do things because they weren't involved in the decisions. They don't understand the decisions, and there's not transparency and traceability. So my advice, start small, start very open, think about helping people understand the whys as much as the outs. Chris, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, 100% yes. I think, there's so much opportunity with AI, and there's definitely opportunity with not only looking at the smaller set of activities with AI, but looking at the larger, more broader tools that we can go after, and some of the more creative activities that we can go after as well. But yeah, there's significant dangers associated to these technologies, and so these are things that we just have to manage against.
Okay, let's jump into our next poll question. So, practical implementation, where does the most resistance to AI adoption come from in your organization? Okay, some questions coming in. And I'm really loving some of the distribution of the answers right now coming through. Okay, we'll give it another few seconds. All right. Well, so plant floor operators are the first, but then QA teams and leadership are about the same in terms of where resistance comes from. Really interesting. Let's jump into the next question around that. So, Chris, when a food or beverage company engages in frame and flight with AI for compliance on the agenda, what does a realistic readiness assessment look like in the first 90 days? Could you share more about the type of AI projects you've worked on?
Yeah, so I guess as far as the first 90 days and the assessments that we end up doing, we do a lot of ideation sessions with companies, and then we'll do infrastructure builds as well to support some of these more larger, I would say, building readiness capability for AI. And within the first 90 days, what we've kind of noticed is that we have to frankly reset expectations. So the many customers just jump right into the use cases. So they'll ask, where can we apply AI? How can we build an agent to do X or an agent to do Y? And frankly, that's usually the wrong starting point. You're kind of jumping over all of these other things that you need to consider. And so for those of you that are not super familiar with the term agent and what it means, I thought I would describe it to you because it's kind of important when you think about how to actually approach it within your business. And so an agent is really just a program that's connected to an LLM, which is also connected to tools like Excel or Outlook, but it's also connected to your data. So out of those three pieces, the LLM, the tools, and the data, the only component of that is yours, that you have full control over, is the data. So you don't have control over those other pieces and how they operate. And so that's where we focus with our customers. Data is the only truly thing that you can control. And so that's the thing that we can get control over as well. So the correct starting point is infrastructure and data. And the first 90 days ultimately focus on building agents, not focused on building agents, but it's really focused on determining if AI will work within your environment. And what that typically looks like within organizations is kind of building out three different things. One is this, what we call this deterministic layer, which is, how do you have this data that is gated and has guardrails around it? And then the next piece is this probabilistic layer, which is, I would say, what we would consider your LLMs. So this is the engine the model that will be helping you make decisions. And then the third layer, which is, many people are just forgetting, but are just starting to understand the utilization of it, is this, what we call a knowledge graph. So it's truly understanding how your operations work and why certain things happen. So what pieces of equipment, what are the behaviors of certain pieces of equipment, of people and that sort of stuff. And building out that knowledge graph combined with that probabilistic layer and the deterministic layer will get you to pretty decent insights across the organization. So that's where we focus a lot of our effort: infrastructure, data.
Thank you. So I'm going to advance to a future question where, where do you see AI have real application in food and beverage manufacturing? And I want to start with Dr. Miller, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think as Chris and Dean have been talking about, we're in that progression phase, right? In terms of not just automating or, kind of driving insights from the work that we already do, but being able to, I think in a future state, be able to tie together a bunch of disparate data sources to answer some really interesting questions. An example of that is, let's say you've got a positive pathogen finding in your food because you're doing food testing. Well, your root cause analysis doesn't identify any sort of potential ready source. So are there other data sources that can explain, that association, or might be able to help you drive a root cause because you've connected that data together in a way that it's searchable and that you can analyze it and have some of these AI models do some of that more disparate analysis. That by and large doesn't exist today, but I think that's something, it's just a tangible use case that that demonstrates, I think, a good use of AI in that particular sense. A lot of it's interesting because a lot of this kind of goes back to, there were some good papers published in the peer review literature in the early 2000s just around automation overall, especially in the context of like the FAA and the airline industry as technology started to improve in that space. And I think, we can think of it in terms of a continuum. You've got information acquisition, you've got information analysis, then you have decision making, and then ultimately you have sort of action taking by systems as we build and develop them. So, really what we're talking about here is more on that information acquisition analysis end. And I think, as Chris and Dean have said, where we're trying to move is more in that decision-making place. There's still a human in the loop, but the system is able to take data and use that data in a way that we haven't been able to in the past and present, some interesting solutions, to the end user that haven't existed before. That jump to action taking, I think that's the concern that we saw in the FDA warning letter, right? And so that's a premature use. If you're just overly relying on some of these systems and having them write your SOPs and your product specifications and just not doing any validation of that, it's probably not where we want to be right now.
Totally.
Someone's
Sorry, someone's at my door. Dean, same question to you. Where do you see application in the food and beverage space?
Everywhere, and that's both the curse and the benefit, right? So where do you start? People are overwhelmed right now. So from a practical perspective, one of the things I would do with your continuous improvement teams, et cetera, just a fast 2x2, looking at time to value and business impact. A lot of people are jumping into some of the big projects. Some of people are jumping into the little projects. I think you need to create a portfolio. People need to see wins. They need to see accurate, solid, impactful things. These 2-year projects get very, very difficult to keep momentum behind. So I would start at a facility level and a business level of looking at where you have some of the low-hanging fruit in terms of time to value and some of the more impactful pieces. Areas that we're seeing right now, supplier management and monitoring, supplier holds, writing the cap is doing the root cause stuff is pretty low-hanging fruit. More interesting and more impactful are what I was referring to a minute ago is like the cross-facility commonalities in what are driving CAPAs. So getting underneath an actual CAPA or CAPA resolution and understanding how that is impacting across the organization. There's tons of areas around the supplier risk scoring as you think about understanding now what's happening in the transformation of materials across the facility, both in production and quality. Take that upstream and use that to think about how you pay and manage your suppliers. And those are very impactful. If you can increase the quality of that incoming raw material based on supplier decisions by just a few percentage, that's real effect on yield. And that moves the needle significantly, gets a lot of fairly senior people on board. But being very purposeful versus getting inundated by all the things that you could do with AI, because the application is potentially everywhere. Chris?
Yeah, same sentiment here. There's so many opportunities. It's hard to pick which ones are going to provide the most benefit. So I mean, where you see this in product innovation is staying ahead of consumer trends. That's been in play for a long time now, and supporting product builds from ideation to commercialization, so that there's AI and agentic workflows that are being built into those tools pretty heavily. And then from a plant side, I hear again and again unplanned downtime and getting some analysis around that, decision support just in general, and production planning. And for those folks that are on the call that are within the agricultural industry, which is kind of food and beverage adjacent, there's some very amazing use cases coming out there, and one involves it involves cattle, it involves headphones, and an algorithm that they're calling a cowgorithm. and so such an interesting way to, I mean, essentially what they're doing is they're using these headphones to steer the cattle into different pastures, and then they geofence these pastures, the new pastures frankly, just right on their phone. And so not only does it save them fencing costs, but it also what it also does is they're using this cowgorithm to look at the stimuli and then the responses of the cows, and then adjusting the hardware appropriately. So I mean, there's just such cool ideas out there.
Very cool. Let's jump into our next poll. So on ROI and accountability, if an AI tool gave your team a compliance recommendation that turned out to be wrong, who do you think would be accountable? I assume most of our audience knows the answer to this. I'm going to let Dr. Miller tell us what's the appropriate answer on this poll.
good. We'll see if it changes at all. I know it's still open, but it looks like we've got some unanimous consensus there
Yes,
so
I think
far.
we're getting ready to close the poll. Most people have had their chance to answer.
Sounds good. Yeah, I mean, I think as you can see, as we can all see, at least for those that have answered, right? It's the entity making the food, right? Like that's ultimately who's responsible. And it's certainly when you look at it from a regulatory standpoint, that would be the case. Any of these things are still just tools that you're using. And I think, to the point that's come up sort of multiple times at this point, how do you build these systems in a way that you understand how they work and that you're able to validate its performance and then go on and verify it on an ongoing basis? I think that's going to be key to this in terms of ongoing verification. So when we talk about agents and creating agents, how often are we checking to make sure that the outputs of those, the recommendations, their interpretation of the data are correct, and how do we build that into the process? So again, to kind of bring it back to the conversation around FSMA, all of those are FSMA related elements. I think, how we think about implementing them and the frequency in which we do it from a verification standpoint, that becomes a discussion, in terms of what good practice looks like to support compliance. But all of those elements are there. And I think, as you can see from the poll respondents, pretty unanimous in terms of who's ultimately responsible.
Okay, let's move into the next question. Or actually, sorry, Dr. Miller, or not Dr. Miller, Chris, do you also have any thoughts? Oh, sorry, I'm all over the place. Dr. Miller, AI tools can produce incorrect outputs, outdated regulatory references, flawed recommendations, model drifts. How should manufacturers approach validating the tools they're relying on for compliance critical decisions?
Yeah, I think, it obviously it's going to depend on the problem you're trying to solve and what those systems are designed to do. But, I think, as has been mentioned by Dean and Chris, when you're taking data and training those models, are you getting the expected outputs, or how to, what's the human feedback as part of that training process to make sure that you're developing a model or a response that behaves the way that you want it to initially. And then again, it gets back to that verification piece. I think, one of the challenges, at least that we've seen with, some of these AI models, depending again on use case and application, and let's just take like visual models, for example. So things that use images to try to determine, a certain outcome. You need a fair amount of training data, right? And you also need to make sure that that model is not necessarily biased in terms of its performance overall. And I think a good example of that, from a few years ago is using images in an AI model to try to predict if a particular mole was cancerous or not, right? Well, some of that initial training data in that particular application looked at anything where a ruler was present in that image was more typically likely to be flagged as cancerous, just because that was kind of the way it showed up in the training data. So it requires a fundamental understanding of the data that these models are being trained on, and especially if it's internal company data. One, do you have enough of it? Two, is it high quality enough? And then three, how do we understand that data to have any sort of potential for being biased? I think that's just one example of the considerations that need to be in place when we're building these systems so that they behave in a way that's somewhat predictable and that's giving outputs that we can hopefully trust.
Okay, Chris, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the same. There should always be a human in the loop here with any decision associated with AI. I think we know that these models have their flaws, and they just generally need oversight. They should not be fully trusted. So the reality of these AI systems is that the outputs ultimately can be improved and controlled with providing guardrails around your data and having a good knowledge graph and all of that stuff. But errors are always going to occur, and so it's critical that we actively manage against that risk. Case in point, there was an interesting. This happened a couple years ago, but there was a fairly large retailer that had put a a restocking robot out into one of their stores, and the restocking robot ended up losing its way, got out into the parking lot, and started restocking the parking lot. And it took about 4 employees to kind of coax that robot back into the store before they could shut it down. So I mean, there's these really hilarious moments where we think we're really smart and we put these technologies in play, and it kind of backfires on us. And then something that just happened last night too. So my son, he's in 5th grade, and he did this thing where he was working on a math problem. He thought he solved it correctly. He went into ChatGPT. He plugged in the solution to his problem and what the problem was, and ChatGPT enthusiastically said, "Yes, that's the correct answer." But then he ended up getting it wrong, and turns out that his teacher was right and ChatGPT was wrong. And so this is 5th grade math. So if it can make errors with 5th grade math, I mean, we just have to, treat these tools with care, right? And
it's like everything, validate.
Yep. Validating will be very tough on the manufacturing floor with AI tech, but it'll get better over time.
Okay. The next question that we have is for all panelists. So food safety culture has always been about people as much as process. Does AI strengthen that culture? Does it risk creating distance between workers and the outcomes they're responsible for? We'll start with Dean.
I mean, these are change management programs. So every change has the potential to disenfranchise or alienate people involved in the change. We should be treating these as classic change management programs with all the good work that's been evolved over the years to figure those out. If you put good data in the hands, good and explainable data in the hands of an operator, they'll be all in. I mean, these are food safety cultures. Going back to Frank's Rianis's books and things like that. These are cultures that are dedicated their lives and their careers to managing risk and ensuring safety for consumers. If you give them good actionable data, it's a boon for them. If you don't make them part of the process, if you give them the algorithm set X, to Chris's son's point, yes, if you don't help them understand the traceability, et cetera, then no, you will disenfranchise them. But that is true of any change management program. You need to bring people into the decision-making. You need to help them understand the impact on them, the impact on their decision-making. Done right, this can be an absolute boon for food safety cultures. But like any technology change, if you do it wrong, it will go bad quick.
Dr. Miller, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think Dean's got the right of it. I think if these initiatives are kind of brought forth in a way that, we're going to just drive, efficiency as much as possible, and that, reduces headcount, in the food safety quality space, I think, that's going to press against people's willingness to adopt these systems. Again, I go back to, in very few instances have I seen, food safety quality teams that are overstaffed. So, I think being able to talk about both the potential benefits of using these systems and bringing, the users along as part of the design and development process is really key in building that trust. And that's, if we talk about food safety culture, that has to start at the leadership level, right? With everything that we know about food safety culture. So it's going to be up to the leadership if they want to bring some of these solutions into place to make sure that it's done in a way that people want to buy into and participate with these systems. Otherwise, you certainly run the risk of, just a lack of buy-in, a lack of trust, people creating these shadow systems because they don't trust the system or because they feel like they're not, their position's at risk. So these are good conversations to have, and I think they're going to be important conversations to have for the coming years as people think about adopting some of these tools.
Any thoughts from you, Chris, on this?
Yeah, I guess just briefly, because I think both Dr. Miller and Dean had some really, really good points, and I don't want to repeat too many of them. But I think the food safety culture, it strengthens them by helping these teams better understand and managing risk at a more granular level. So the benefits of these technologies is that, frankly, it can see things that we don't necessarily have the capacity to see or have the bandwidth to see. And so, and as we know with food safety and food safety culture, the risk often lies in small overlooked details, and these details can accumulate into much larger and larger issues. I mean, you look at some of the recall, the big recalls, and over the last like 10, 20 years, it's these small little incremental issues that just kind of bloom into very large catastrophes in some cases. And so, my core belief is that the devil's in the details, and these small gaps, not big failures, are often what leads to risk. And identifying and kind of exposing those is going to help strengthen these food safety teams.
Thank you. In essence of time, because I do want to get to some questions from the audience, I'm going to ask one last question of all of you. The question that maybe all of us are semi-thinking, right? Is AI going to replace my job? Let's start with you, Chris.
Yeah, so 100% no. So I don't think the issue is, really about AI replacing people. It's just that, do we have the bandwidth to manage everything that we have on our plate these days? And the answer to that is no, we don't. I think what AI is going to do is it's going to expose, a lot of this, or allow us to manage more with less, so to speak. And so, we'll be able to, manage the business at a more granular level. So ultimately moving from this reactive high level of oversight to this proactive detail-driven management, which is, I think, generally what we all kind of want to see, right? I think that's what the business wants to see, and I think it's what we in factory teams want to see as well. And so we're I think the ground truth here is that there's no system today is continuously improving facilities on their own. I don't see that anywhere. And so operational excellence still and will always require people.
What about you, Dr. Miller? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm both glass half full, glass half empty on this one. I think AI is going to be a disruptive technology, and I think, if you look back, to the turn of the 19th century, 1900s, if you were a blacksmith or a farrier who was putting horseshoes on horses, like, you're probably going to lose your job, as Henry Ford started to roll Model Ts off the assembly line. So, this represents, in some ways, I think, an important and fundamental shift in the way that we just work with data systems and what they're capable of. And I think, as that capability grows, it's going to shift needs in different sectors and for different types of roles and positions. And so for some people, I think that will mean more pressure on the position that they hold. What I can say is I think, having familiarity with these tools, understanding what they can do, understanding what they can't do, positions people well for kind of that next phase. So there's kind of a growing amount of AI sort of backlash and, kind of pushback around these systems for a variety of reasons that we're not going to talk about here, in terms of data centers and fear about job loss. And so, I think that's a concern that we shouldn't lose sight of. And at the same time, we want to make sure that we're as educated on kind of where this technology is headed and understand how to use these tools in an effective and useful way.
Dean, what about you?
I'm kind of with Dr. Miller on the glass half full. Tremendous tools, tremendous decision support capability. Human in the loop, absolutely. Do you need as many humans? Probably not. I think the question, as Dr. Miller was framing it, is probably the more appropriate, is will AI affect my role and my day, my life? That part of that is a job question. Do I have a job? Do I not? But then in many cases, the bigger question for people will be, AI will replace a lot of administrative, it will replace a lot of, but it's going to put a higher burden on knowledge work, decision work, process work. So I think it's a little bit of both. It'd be naive of us to think that there's no displacement. But then we also need to think about our vertical, right? There is a massive labor shortage and potential labor impact with continuing retirements, other macroeconomic factors, et cetera. So it's an industry that still needs people. And in some ways, AI can help meet some of that need. So it's a very complex question just at the plant or the facilities, leaving aside some of the bigger existential challenges that Dr. Miller alludes to, which are not going to be inconsequential.
So I think we have time for maybe 2 questions. Some of the other questions submitted, what we'll have to do is ask the panelists to answer some of them offline, and we'll send them out to everyone, because I know there was someone who is very wanted to get his questions answered, and I'm not sure we'll get to all of them. So, Dr. Miller, I'll ask you this question. One of the ones that came in live, do we believe the FDA and the administration is committed to traceability and specifically the 28 deadline? I mean, it's semi-related.
Semi-related, but a good question. I think the indications that I've seen so far is yes, anything in politics, it's always sort of subject to change, right? So Congress can always say, hey, this is a rule that we no longer want to see the agency or the executive branch administer. I have not seen, strong evidence that that's the case. And I think the agency, as best I can tell, is committed to the time frame that we're working on, I wear a different hat as part of the Partnership for Food Traceability. And, we have weekly conversations around how is industry kind of driving towards compliance there. So I would say if there's any attendees that are interested in joining that conversation, it's a good place to look and have, interactions with FDA and the agency. So short answer, no. But, there's always an asterisk, anything subject to change.
Okay. This next question came in pre-submitted. I'm going to ask it to Chris. How can organizations responsibly leverage the AI-driven compliance intelligence to meet FDA and FSMA requirements, such as preventative controls, traceability, record keeping, while ensuring the data integrity, regulatory transparency, and inspection readiness? The long question.
Yeah, that's a big one. Yeah, so I mean, we all know and we've talked about this for over quite a bit over the last hour, but we all know that these these AI tools, frankly, just are fundamentally flawed. They make mistakes. They're not validated pieces of software for us, and so we have to be very careful about what we trust and what we don't trust from these tools. So yes. So but with that, you kind of have to leverage those tools because they do provide a significant amount of value. So I feel like as we're extending ourselves into AI, the leveraging it for decision support, even if it's incorrect from that initial set of points that it might deliver back to you, there are often nuggets within these outputs that they have based on questions that you have or questions on a framework, and those nuggets end up spurring other thoughts for you to kind of ponder on and kind of grow and mature as well. So there's a good amount of uses for this within food safety, within understanding FSMA guidelines, all of this, but take it with a grain of salt and grab the nuggets that you see there.
Okay. We'll wrap. I want to give you all the opportunity to share any last thoughts. Dean?
Just building on Chris's point, yes, we need to be aware of the challenges in technology, but I think Dr. Miller made the point earlier, humans are also flawed. If you statistically compare decisions between humans and an LLM, as many times as we ding the LLM, right? Statistically, given the same sets of decision inputs, the LLMs are often more correct. And so for us going forward, it's figuring out the processes and the guardrails that take advantage of the best elements of human, best elements of these agentic systems, at least for the next couple of years, right? Who knows? My crystal ball doesn't go past the next couple of years because the pace of change is so dramatic. But right now, we have an incredible opportunity to combine the best of those two points in life in the spirit of food safety culture, right? So get started, now. Lay down the foundations of the data consistency, process consistencies, etc. Pick a couple of places where you think you can have true measurable impact. I don't think you can wait.
Dr. Miller, any last thoughts?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, I think conversations like this are important, right? It's a fast moving technology. I think, we all have some sense of use cases and what it might look like and how it might function. And at the same time, what that could look like or how it might function in 6 or 12 months could be significantly different. I think critical thinking skills, a little bit of skepticism, and just having expertise and understanding what your processes are still going to be really key and important in terms of that human in loop aspect. I think as humans, we still want to know that somebody is there looking at the outputs of these systems and that there is that review process. I think when we think about getting on an airplane, would you get on an airplane without a pilot? The plane might mostly fly itself anyways, but we want to know that somebody's there that understands how the plane works, how it flies, and can take over, if there's an emergency. So I think that's true of these systems, but we're in a period of inflection and it's gonna be an interesting ride for the next 5 years.
I love that example because I want an operator on the top of my plane. Chris, any last thoughts?
Uh, yeah. So when I think about maturity, I think maybe a lot of us, and I've been in facilities and worked in facilities where this was the case, where we were largely paper based, and moving from paper, off of paper into digital systems was a very big deal. And then once you're off of paper and in those digital systems, maturing that is a very arduous and very hard task to do as well. But I think it's something that we have to actively think about. I mean, where we see the value that AI can provide to us, and really the only thing that's inhibiting us is whether we're capturing the right information in a digital way. And so I would press on everybody to just focus on, like, where can you actually excel in that maturity. And it doesn't matter, you're not too far behind right now if you're on paper. It's just, you got to think about how to actually start moving down that digital maturity curve. And so yeah, that's what I would leave everybody with.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dean, Dr. Miller, Chris, for joining us today for this lively session. We appreciate your time and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great to be with you. Thanks.
All right. Well, as we wrap up, reminder, there is a food and beverage manufacturing survey that there's a chance to win a $500 gift card on. Please take a moment to help us inform all of you by sharing your thoughts. Next slide. Please join us in May on Friday, May 29th. We will be looking to seek and destroy responding to Listeria positives with Stephen Tezuki. And just a reminder, you know where to find some extra resources. You can find them at the Acheson Group on their webpage, and then also on the resources section on the SafetyChain website. We will be sending out this recording in an email, and then we will try to get some of the questions answered. I'm not sure if we'll be able to get them all today, but we will attempt. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend. Bye.